Good morning. We will get our program started. On behalf of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at George Washington University, on behalf of the Dean Michael Brown, and the faculty and students, I want to welcome all of you. It's nice to have you here with us this morning. I just wanted to thank, there are so many people here who are former colleagues and lots of friends and others, so I'm not going to mention all, but I am happy that we have representatives from the American Foreign Service Association, which is a very important organization in the life of the profession. And I say that without any further delay, let me introduce the President of the American Academy of Diplomacy, Ambassador Ron Newman.
This is to prove that diplomats can be succinct. Skip, thank you very much. Thank you for your help in getting this organized, and the Elliott School's help, and thank you for your participation in the Academy in many ways. For those of you who don't know us, the American Academy of Diplomacy is a small organization of former senior diplomats. It's actually been around about 30 years, and its purpose is improving American diplomacy. It does not, as an organization, take positions on major issues of policy, partly because we would never get our membership all in agreement, but it does focus very hard on questions of improving the professionalism of the service, improving the quality of American diplomacy, and it has done a number of previous reports on that, dealing with resources, dealing with the number of people needed to carry out diplomacy, needed the kind of professional education and training which is needed. And as we do these reports, we find that nobody else does them. There are more reports about the State Department than you can hit with a stick, and they all deal with policy and organization and form, and not one of them ever says, what do you need to actually carry out this mission? That was the purpose of this report. I just want to note our profound gratitude to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Delavan Foundation, Carol Sisko, and the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, whose funding made possible this work. And with that note, let me pass to our chairman and co-chair of the project, Tom Pickering, and co-chair and vice chairman of the Academy, Marc Grossman, to actually talk about the substance of why we're here. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thanks, Ron, very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me join in first your thanks to those who helped us to fund this. Even more, my thanks to you and to Marc and to Lang and others who led the hard work in getting the report together and getting some coordination within the American Academy of Diplomacy and bringing all the ideas together that we have, in fact, got before us. I think it's important, and I noticed today there are two headlines in the news. One is that Nigeria has an election, and it's seemingly a fair election, which is unusual for Nigeria. But I suspect our diplomacy, in fact, I know our diplomacy played a role from the president on down, the secretary and others in keeping it that way, and the professional foreign service was very much engaged. And the other is, as of now, I think we have still no result on the Iran talks, which is not surprising to any of us. But I know, in fact, it's because we have to work hard to get those right. And it's the Secretary and the Foreign Service and the technical advice that he's getting across U.S. diplomacy, including those career civil servants who've made their lives in this particular issue, that are working hard to get it right as we speak. The backdrop of all of this is that a number of us were concerned and wrote an op-ed a little while ago. Ron and Susan Johnson and I joined together because we felt there was a increasing, put it this way, assault on and failure to have serious professionalism as a continued mantra and indeed goal of our diplomacy, of our foreign service, and certainly of how and in what way it worked together with the civil service and the State Department. We were perhaps encouraged in that particular belief by the response of the State Department, which produced a press release saying their goal was, in fact, to break down the law with respect to the Foreign Service, And indeed, that was in itself stimulus enough to say maybe this was worth taking a much more succinct and careful, and put it this way, studied look at the problem. Today we have a studied look at the problem, and it's, on my view, perhaps the most important report we have engaged in. It's called American Diplomacy at Risk, and we're serious about that against the backdrop of an age in which diplomacy is going to become even more important. Having tried the use of military force to solve diplomatic problems, we found that that's not the answer. But diplomacy has to be professional. It has to understand the problems, and it has to provide the kind of advice to the senior leadership of this country that is, in fact, aware of, capable of, and put it this way, extremely smart about getting our diplomatic policies and approaches correctly. We've seen now a number of failures of professionalism, and in a minute we'll try to detail these with our recommendations. But some of those have had to do with what I think has been the creeping inflation of political appointments within the State Department, not just at upper levels, but down through the service as a whole. And one only has to look at the changes in upper levels over the recent years. The facts are that 8 out of 10 of the top jobs in the State Department are now not career Foreign Service officers or career professionals of any stripe. And that's just one important indication of what we see is the failure of professionalism. So the report will look at the question of what is basically the problem of appointments and professionalism, and we take a very strong view that professional ambassadors are an important asset of the United States, that the seeming selling of office for cash in campaign contributions is, in our view, our humble, non-legal judgment, totally contrary to American law, but even more totally contrary to the history, the values of our country, of our national service, and indeed of our profession. And we make a recommendation that the future for non-professional ambassadors is clear, but it ought to move from the current 30% to 10% as the kind of goal to be sought by both parties in a non-political atmosphere to bring together the best that the country has to offer in professional people as well as those from outside. We're concerned about the department's interest in failure totally to define the roles of the Foreign Service and the Civil Service, and to be hooked on the notion that somehow the two services can and ought to be homogenized. One of our strongest recommendations is the department needs to define those roles and then needs to make sure that those two services can operate in the kind of harmony that's necessary to combine the background, the language, cultural, area knowledge, and experience of the Foreign Service overseas with the technical knowledge that the Civil Service colleagues bring us. We've seen a serious failure in the department to pay attention to the Civil Service, and we'll talk about some of the recommendations we think that is needed to make that a more effective instrument of our diplomacy as we go down the road. We're concerned by the fact that this is running contrary to the Foreign Service Act of 1980 and its major strictures with respect to the Foreign Service and its role. And we're concerned that there's a shift in particularly those most important jobs that are significant in training Foreign Service officers, particularly in Washington, to assume the responsibilities that the Act confers upon them. And finally, we believe that there is a continued dearth of excellent, high-quality education. People are entering the Foreign Service from many different fields, and it's extremely important, and it's a value. But they enter the Foreign Service with less knowledge of, in fact, who, how, and in what our history and indeed our government organization has served to make us a professional Foreign Service. And we see that the comparisons with what other countries are doing are fairly stark. And so we're recommending a much more rigorous approach to the question of how and in what way Foreign Service officers are prepared, trained, educated, and how and in what way our Civil Service colleagues can enjoy and indeed benefit from the same approach to professional work in our diplomatic service. Those are just a few early thoughts. I'm now going to turn the floor over to the Vice Chairman on the report, and indeed a gentleman who needs no introduction to you, who has been both Director General of the Foreign Service, Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, three of the top jobs in the Foreign Service, and three that in every conceivable way has prepared him to be the expert on these kinds of questions. And so, Mark, with that little encomium, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. I wanted to say that I agreed with everything Tom had to say except for the last few sentences. First of all, thank you very much.
You don't have to agree with that.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you all for coming. Thank you, Skip, and all of the people here at the Elliott School, as Tom did, for opening your offices and home to us. I also wanted to join Ambassador Pickering in thanking all of those people who had such an enormous part to do with bringing this report together. The drafting group, all of the people at the American Academy of Diplomacy. But I might also say, if you look on page 6 of the report, you'll see an advisory group there that did us an enormous amount of good. We met on a number of occasions, took people's advice and counsel. We had a very effective red team headed by Ambassador Rao. So we've tried to sort of reach out as best we could to a large number of people who had a large number of views about this subject. And so I just wanted to say thanks to all of them as well. Second thing I'd like to say by way of introduction, and you'll also see this early on in the report, is although the report calls for a number of changes in the way that we do business, it does explicitly and very enthusiastically say how much we admire the work that is being done today by Foreign Service and Civil Service people in Washington and all around the world. As Ambassador Pickering said in his two examples, Nigeria, Iran, but in places all around our world, in hard places all around our world, and over in Washington, in the State Department in Washington, D.C., there are people serving today, and we admire them and we support them. And one of the reasons that we have put this report together was to show that more could be done for the people who are currently serving our country. Also, I note in the report that there is, a lot of progress to report, particularly at the Foreign Service Institute and other places. And that's all, I think, comes through as well, and I hope that you'll take a look at those pieces. For me, when I kind of look at this report, I'll give you 3 or 4 points by way of kind of introduction, and then I'd like to talk particularly about questions of nullification and the civil service. First, there's a very important theme to this report, which comes on its very first pages, and I hope comes through the report as well, and that is the American Academy of Diplomacy. The people who've signed on to this report believe that as a strong State Department is absolutely vital to our capacity to do the right thing by diplomacy for the United States of America, and that strong State Department is based upon a strong Foreign Service and a strong civil service. And that's the groups who are unique, different, but working together that produce a strong department. And that's a theme I think that's extremely important. Strong State Department, crucial to America's national security, based on a strong Foreign Service and a strong civil service. Second, you'll also see in the report, I think the language in there is very clear, that the report tries to look in 2 ways. And that is, it looks to some of the problems that Ambassador Pickering talked about in his initial comments. Politicization, the attempt to nullify the Foreign Service Act of 1980. These efforts that kind of are putting pressure on the Foreign Service and the Civil Service. And it makes recommendations about how to deal with some of those questions. But it looks another way as well, and that is a recognition that the Foreign Service, and as best as we could, although not being experts, the Civil Service has work to do itself, and that there are internal things that we need to get a hold of in terms of training, in terms of our own capacities. And so the report in that sense looks 2 ways, and I think that's a perfectly fair way to think about it. 2 more points. One is on the question of nullification of the Foreign Service Act of 1980. This is a very important issue that came kind of increasingly forward throughout all of our deliberations. The importance of the act, which defines the Foreign Service, which defines its responsibility, which defines its way forward, is, in the view of so many people who participated in this report, today really, as the ambassador said, kind of under siege and under assault. And it's the law of the land. And one of the things that we have tried to convey in this report is that it's the law ought to be followed. And there are a lot of implications there. One of the things that's interesting about the report is, and I can take this, I take this personally for myself, is there's a line in the report that says some people would be surprised, I think, to hear that this was the policy of the department. And I think more and more people who learned about this were surprised. And people said, can that be true? This press guidance that came out saying that an attempt to, break down the barriers between the Foreign Service and the civil service, could that be right? Well, as the report says, we reluctantly concluded that it is right. And one of the reasons that people are speaking out today is to try to raise this issue. And so you will find in the report the recommendations that people obey the law, that they cease this attempt to nullify the Foreign Service Act of 1980, return some of the conversation as people talk about the Foreign Service to Foreign Service officers, to the Foreign Service, in a way that, not in a way that defines the work, and as Ambassador Pickering said, also very importantly, to how people get appointed to jobs, and particularly to ambassadorial nominations. Last point from me, and that is that I think as people came together to produce this report, it's American diplomacy at risk, and as I say, strong State Department, strong Foreign Service, strong civil service. And so one of the things that we tried to do in this report, and you'll see in chapters, is also recognize that it isn't just the Foreign Service that's having a challenge in this new world, it's our colleagues in the civil service as well. And I make this point particularly because the American Academy of Diplomacy has as its members some very distinguished retired civil service officers who served with distinction in our diplomacy. And they too came together to say, we had a challenge here. There's similar challenges about politicization, about the kind of career paths people can expect, about the education and the way forward for people in the civil service. And we believe that no report called American Diplomacy at Risk could focus only on the Foreign Service. It had to focus on the department. And that's why you'll see, I think, quite strong recommendations about the civil service as well. And it goes back to that theme. Strong State Department based on a strong Foreign Service and a unique and different and strong civil service. And so by way of introduction, I give you those words, and Ambassador Pickering, I turn this back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I should also say how much we're indebted to the cooperation we've had from the American Foreign Service Association. I'm a member. They are for active serving Foreign Service officers. They are their official representative by election. They play a very important role. I'm glad that Ian is here. I'm sorry that Rob wasn't able to be with us, but nevertheless, we're very grateful because we worked very closely with them, sought to find common ground in all of this. They will speak best for themselves about the report, but I do believe, in fact, that across the board, they were helpful and very much part of where we are trying to go here. And they will, in accordance with the report, in my view, have a very important role to play because a number of the issues that we raise are issues in which their role is to represent those of you who are active duty Foreign Service officers in dealing with those kinds of problems. I see three areas here where it is important to think about solutions. One is in AFSA's role with the department. The second is in the department's role in its own responsibilities to the two services. And the third is obviously our friends in the Congress who've shown an interest in this report, who have a serious sense of its value and significance, who will be addressing the perennial problem in the Congress of an authorization bill, and we hope very much that they will keep the report in mind as they go through that process, and we will work with them to assure that that's the case. In no case in this particular report have we believed this is the responsibility of any one administration or of any one secretary. We think there is, in fact, while there is not bipartisan cooperation, certainly in the Congress, there is bipartisan responsibility for how we got here. And in effect, maybe it will call for a bipartisan answer. I also think that Secretary Kerry's interest in the service, his dissent from the service, if I can put it that way, and I don't mean coming down, I mean coming out, is very important, and I think that he will have a keen interest in this, and we've done our best to make sure that he knows where we are and where we're going, and hope that, in fact, over a period of time, he and his team will be part of what we believe is the necessary corrective action.
Good.
We're open to your questions, believe it or not.
We had questions.
Yes.
We all stunned into silence.
Yes, please.
Thank you for that. Can you speak a little
Can you just identify yourself, please?
Layla Camper, FSI. Could you speak a little bit to the methodology behind the advisory group and who was on it? I know that the report speaks to both foreign service and civil service. What was the breakdown of people who were part of the advisory team that produced the report in terms of foreign service?
The advisory team was majority foreign service, but we tried to bring in, first of all, people who had experience and expertise in the civil service, and people who actually had been civil service employees at the State Department with long experience.
Dick?
Dick Solomon. Seems to me you're gonna make progress only if you get strong support out of the Congress. I mean, secretaries of state, as we all know, have limited terms. They have very focused agendas. Congress is there with the money and presumably a greater element of continuity. It would have been nice to, it would be useful to have an event following on this one where you get couple of supporters out of Congress to endorse what you're doing here. Is there any prospect of doing that?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that we've consulted with Congress. I think that our consultations with the Congress are part of what at the moment is a little bit privileged, but I think it ought to be very clear, as I said early on, that we have briefed them and we have in fact begun to suggest that there are themes, activities, and recommendations of this report that they would logically have an interest in, and we see some real resonance in that, Dick. So the hope is we can. The hope is that we might have hearings. The hope is that we will get people who will speak out on this. The hope is that perhaps where legislation might be required, legislation will be forthcoming. But you and I know the long checkered history of authorization legislation, but there seems to be a serious determination now, and certainly we would support that, particularly if it includes the recommendations that we're making.
I heard somebody ask to repeat the question. The question was obvious, which was, you know, this is good, but what about the Congress?
Yeah.
We do now have some mics, so.
Okay.
Is there another question? Have we-
Could I circle back just one thing? I had one additional thought on my answer to your question. Between Foreign Service and Civil Service people who served in the department, majority Foreign Service, but I think you'll also see that we tried to reach out to people who were the head of think tanks and people who'd been political appointees at the department. Bob Kimmett's name you'll see on there, Ellen Leipson. So I gave you a technical answer to your question, but a larger group, we tried to bring a larger group of opinion.
And if I may, in terms
Yeah,
of
please.
Yeah, would you just hang on for a microphone for a second? Now that we have one in play.
Yeah, good.
what's your plan for follow-up and socialization with both the Foreign Service and Civil Service beyond this event?
Yeah, well, there's an enormous amount. This is our beginning of our rollout, but just as Ambassador Solomon said, you know, yes, the Congress is important, but also there's an enormous amount of effort to be done kind of inside the Foreign Service, inside the Civil Service, and I think in the public as well. And I say one of the reasons that we put a number of public members on the advisory board was to try to create this effort to make this a matter of conversation. One of the challenges will be to kind of have the conversation at a serious enough level where people get the themes of it, but as Ambassador Pickering said, and here working with AFSA and other groups, there are some very specific recommendations that are going to have to be negotiated that, you know, may require some change. And so it'll be a combination of getting the conversation started and then trying to push through the very specific recommendations that are there.
Maybe I could just add, it's been the tradition in the American Academy that only half of our effort is expended on preparing the report. The other half is hopefully in being able to socialize it, as you said. Right. And that in some we have been more successful than others, but our record is very clearly that we see that the first half, in our view, has been successfully done, but the second half is ahead of us. And I would like nothing better, and this is a solicitation for something like the Secretary's Open Forum Panel, to seek some of us to come by and talk about this inside the department. We will certainly work with AFSA to see if there are opportunities there. There may even be a few representatives of the press here today. They were invited, and we will continue to work with them. And we've gotten enormous help there from AFSA in particular, and we will do that. As I said in response to Dick Solomon's excellent question, we are also working on the Hill, and we'll continue to do that. And if you see other opportunities, we are more than happy to have suggestions.
We'd be glad to come out to FSI.
And I might just add that we've already started talking to AFSA about holding some form of town hall type of meeting, probably in their quarters. Date not yet picked, but anyway, we're not only wide open, we will be actively working on that. Have we, let's see.
Yes, gentlemen.
Hey, here.
I'm Harry Kopp. If the department is working to nullify the Foreign Service Act, did you find any indication that the department would like to see the act amended or to write a new Foreign Service Act from scratch?
I think that's an interesting point, Harry. My own feeling is, and I may be wrong, but some of this comes out of what has been seen in the department as some kind of traditional contest between the Foreign Service and the Civil Service. My long experience has been the other way around, that I've seen efforts at cooperative and serious working together as part of the issue. And in fact, the idea that we are one team, in my view, should prevail. But the notion that everybody is competent to do every job, or everybody is equally prepared to do every job, is a harder concept, I think, to make and sell. We see in the military that, in fact, Defense Department civilians don't move right away to be submarine commanders or special forces commanders. And in some ways, those are activities that require background and professional training in terms of the armed services side that's quite different. My feeling is that each service brings to the diplomacy of the United States essential elements. And my concern about the failure to decide how and in what way they should be put together is part of that, as well as my concern of the fact that each of us in many ways will benefit, if I could put it this way, from essentially carrying out the Foreign Service Act as it was conceived of in 1980 and it was originally predicated in 1924. That doesn't mean, in fact, that the world hasn't changed, but it means that the principles that were there, a merit service for the Foreign Service, a high degree of mobility, rank in person, the ability to compete on a regular time period for merit promotions, and the civil service, which has a different structure, have to be looked at. One of the recommendations we made is, in order to try to give the civil service more opportunities for advancement and a professional career track, one of the things that's lacking is that a small accepted service be created for civil service officers to compete for Foreign Service positions on the basis that they would be rotating. The civil service has a rank in job, which means that, in fact, it's permanent occupancy for good performance, and that many of the jobs that might be permanently occupied by civil service are, in our view, important for the preparation of Foreign Service officers for further work in their own profession. And so in order to bring these together, and to provide that kind of opportunity, but without disadvantaging either service, that idea is incorporated in the report. That may be more than you wanted to hear in answer to your question. Harry, you know this better than any of us, but thank you for the question.
Do we have one more? And then here.
Yeah,
one
this gentleman here.
Hi, Tom Hill from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, majority staff. To what extent have your findings fed into the forthcoming QDDR process?
Maybe I can
Yes, go
speak
ahead,
to
Ron,
that.
because you've talked to him more.
We have had an ongoing but informal dialogue with Tom Perriello and his office at several different removes in the process. So he's had a pretty good idea of what we're thinking about, although we have not exchanged papers directly. And we've had a chance to listen. We're not writing their report, they're not writing ours, but we have had a cross-fertilization that has been fairly active. and I'll find out how good it is when I see the QDDO. I think that, maybe
Tex.
let's let Tex, you got the last question.
He always does have the last word.
Thank you both. Thank the AAD leadership. This is so important. The strength of the Foreign Service is its ability to send the right person to the right job at the right time. And that leaves the Foreign Service vulnerable to attack. And that is what has happened. The problem that we face is the major politicization, not only in the State Department, but also in the Defense Department, in USAID, and another agency which I serve, EPA. This is a trend in the government, and I'm very proud that the AAD has stood up and pointed out the facts for all. I trust that AFSA and the new AFSA elected board will follow and very strongly adopt the recommendations that the AAD has put forward for AFSA's action. Thank you very much.
Can I just say, Tex, thank you. To go back to the theme, strong State Department, strong Foreign Service, strong Civil Service. One of the things that really struck me as the drafting group and the advisory group worked together was exactly as you say, how many of the challenges were common to both services, to the politicization. Question about career, question about education, question about professionalization. And so as we got further into this, the theme of strong State Department based on two strong services kind of came out again and again and again because, as you say, the challenges are so similar.
Let me, in closing, just note something. In previous Academy studies, we have worked with think tanks, particularly Stimson Center, which was enormously helpful, and they helped, in this case, in giving us room and space. But we did this report, the Academy did this report basically in-house. And I think it could only have been done that way. But I want to pay special thanks to the drafting group because this is more than about writing. This was about a lot of data collection, too. So if I could just ask Lang Schemmerhorn to stand up, who headed the group, and Clyde Taylor, who was her able assistant. Clyde, stand up. And Susan Johnson, who was a major piece of the data collection. And Tom Boyott, who made sure we never relaxed. Thank you. And also, nothing in the Academy actually would function without our managing director, Amy Stoltz. So, and with that, thank you very much for coming. I hope you will read the report. We've handed you the short form. If anybody wants to really get down into the detail of recommendations, some of the backup, there is a longer form of the report, and that is online. You can find it on our website. Thank you very much for coming.